In the golden haze of the late 1970s, when disco anthems filled the night air and glossy magazines worshipped beauty like a religion, one young woman seemed destined to become the next immortal face of Hollywood. Her name was Dorothy Stratten, a girl from Vancouver who radiated a delicate mix of innocence and allure that made photographers' lenses linger just a little longer. She was more than a model, more than a rising starlet. She was the kind of presence that made people whisper comparisons to Marilyn Monroe, a name forever tied to beauty, tragedy, and mystery. Dorothy's story was the quintessential modern fairy tale, at least on the surface. A young woman working in a Dairy Queen, plucked from obscurity and thrust into the dazzling spotlight of Playboy magazine. In 1980, she was named Playmate of the Year, her photographs celebrated across America, her smile promising an era of light-hearted glamour. Hollywood producers began circling, directors took notice, and Dorothy found herself balancing a career on the edge of true stardom. But behind the shimmering lights and promises of fame, the shadows gathered quickly. Fame is rarely a gift without a price, and Dorothy's rise was entangled with relationships that would ultimately define and destroy her destiny. She was bound to a man who both claimed to love her and seemed incapable of letting her go. At the same time, she was drawn into the orbit of an acclaimed director who saw not just her beauty, but her potential to become a screen legend. The tension between these worlds would set the stage for one of Hollywood's darkest and most chilling tragedies. The fascination with Dorothy Stratten has never truly faded. Her story has been told in whispers, in films, in headlines yellowed by time, each version circling the same haunting question. How could a life so promising, so vibrant, vanish in an instant? Was it simply the cruelty of fate, or was Dorothy caught in a web that Hollywood itself spun too tightly? Tonight, we look back at Dorothy Stratten not as a footnote in a tabloid tragedy, but as a young woman who embodied both the dream and the danger of beauty in the entertainment world. Her life was short, her stardom brief, but her story remains unforgettable. A cautionary tale, a mystery, and a legacy that refuses to fade. This is not just the story of a model. It is the story of innocence lost in the spotlight, of love twisted by obsession, and of a glamorous promise cut short. Dorothy Ruth Hoogstraten, later known to the world as Dorothy Stratten, was born on February 28, 1960, in Vancouver, British Columbia. She grew up in a modest, working-class family, the daughter of Dutch immigrants who had crossed the ocean seeking better opportunities. Life in her childhood home was simple, even austere. Dorothy was described as quiet, shy, and almost ethereal, someone who carried herself with a gentleness that set her apart from her peers. Those who knew her as a young girl remember a sweetness, a kindness, and a natural beauty that never felt forced. In high school, Dorothy wasn't the loud or flamboyant type. Instead, she seemed almost unaware of the effect she had on people. Tall, blonde, and graceful, she caught the attention of classmates, but she carried herself with a kind of innocence that made her seem untouchable. She worked part-time at a Dairy Queen in Vancouver to help support her family. It was behind that counter, serving ice cream and hamburgers, that her life would change forever. It was there that she met Paul Snider, a man almost her opposite in nature. Where Dorothy was soft-spoken and reserved, Paul was ambitious, restless, and consumed by dreams of wealth and fame. He immediately saw in Dorothy not just a girlfriend, but a golden ticket. Snider encouraged her to pose for photographs and eventually submitted them to Playboy magazine. At first, Dorothy hesitated. Modeling for Playboy seemed worlds away from the life she knew, but Snider's persistence and the allure of possibility pushed her forward. In 1978, Dorothy was flown to Los Angeles to test for Playboy. What happened next was nothing short of a transformation. Hugh Hefner and his team immediately recognized that Dorothy wasn't just another beautiful face. She had a glow, an aura that radiated both innocence and sensuality. She became Miss August 1979, and soon after, the doors of Hollywood cracked open for her. Dorothy moved to Los Angeles, leaving behind the quiet rhythms of Vancouver for the blinding lights of California. She quickly adjusted to life in the Playboy mansion, where the glamour was intoxicating and the opportunities seemed endless. Yet, even among the sea of models and actresses, Dorothy stood out. She wasn't brash or hardened by ambition. Instead, she carried herself with an almost old-fashioned grace, something that reminded people of Hollywood's golden era. Within just 2 short years, Dorothy went from serving ice cream cones to being hailed as a rising star, her name appearing in magazines and casting lists. But behind her meteoric ascent, the seeds of her tragic fate had already been planted. By 1980, Dorothy Stratten had become one of the most dazzling new faces in Hollywood. After earning the title of Playmate of the Year, her photographs were everywhere, on magazine covers, centerfolds, and even in advertisements that promised the dawn of a new starlet era. Unlike many models of her generation, Dorothy didn't project an aggressive sexuality. Instead, she embodied a softer, almost angelic charm. It was this delicate balance between innocence and allure that captivated both audiences and industry insiders alike. Her rise wasn't confined to the glossy pages of Playboy. Hollywood soon came calling, eager to mold Dorothy into the next silver screen sensation. She was cast in small roles in films like Autumn-born and Americathon, but her breakthrough came with the comedy Galaxina, 1980, where she played a beautiful android in a satirical sci-fi adventure. While the film itself received mixed reviews, Dorothy's presence on screen was undeniable. Critics noted that even in light-hearted material, she carried an unusual depth, an aura that seemed too luminous to ignore. Dorothy also began to appear on television, guest starring in shows such as Fantasy Island and Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. With each appearance, she was proving she was more than just a pretty face. There was a budding actress within her, one who might, given time, become a true star. Behind the scenes, prominent directors and producers began to notice her potential. Among them was Peter Bogdanovich, the acclaimed filmmaker known for The Last Picture Show. He believed Dorothy could be the next great Hollywood actress, a blend of natural beauty and untapped talent. What made Dorothy so magnetic wasn't just her looks. It was her vulnerability. She radiated a rare kind of authenticity in an industry often defined by artifice. Photographers often remarked that she seemed almost unaware of how striking she was, and that humility gave her an emotional depth that translated beautifully on film. To audiences, she was a dream made real. The small-town girl who had stepped into the spotlight and carried it effortlessly. At only 20 years old, Dorothy's trajectory seemed limitless. She was poised to cross over from the world of modeling to serious film roles, a transition that few playmates had ever managed successfully. Many insiders whispered that she might become a household name, not unlike Marilyn Monroe, whose ghost seemed to linger over every blonde starlet who followed. But just as Dorothy was reaching this glittering peak, the cracks behind the image began to show. For while Hollywood adored her, the world she had left behind, and the man who had helped launch her career, was pulling her into a far darker narrative. Beneath the glittering surface of Dorothy Stratten's meteoric rise, darker tensions began to stir. Though she was celebrated as America's newest starlet, behind closed doors her personal life grew increasingly strained. Most of all in her relationship with Paul Snider, the man who had first introduced her to Playboy. Snider was ambitious but troubled, a man described by many as both charming and dangerously insecure. When Dorothy's fame began to outpace his own dreams of success, he became consumed by jealousy and suspicion. Hollywood executives, photographers, and even Dorothy's co-stars all seemed to recognize her talent and beauty, but to Snider, each new admirer was a threat. He had once been the architect of her career, but now he felt himself fading into the background while Dorothy soared higher. As Dorothy's career blossomed, she also grew emotionally distant from Snider. Living in Los Angeles, she was surrounded by a new world of opportunity, one that highlighted how different her path was from the man who had once guided her. By 1980, she had begun to spend more time in the company of Peter Bogdanovich, who not only believed in her talent but also treated her with a gentleness Dorothy found comforting. To many, their growing connection seemed like the natural evolution of a star discovering her own independence. To Snider, however, it was intolerable. The cracks widened as Dorothy tried to separate her personal ambitions from the controlling influence of her husband. Friends recalled her speaking softly about wanting freedom, about envisioning a future where she could explore acting and relationships without the shadow of Snider looming over her. Yet she was also hesitant. Her compassionate nature made it difficult for her to sever ties completely. That hesitation, tragically, would leave her vulnerable. At the same time, the pressures of fame weighed heavily on her. The Playboy Mansion, though glamorous, was notorious for its politics and rivalries. Dorothy remained sweet and kind, but whispers followed her. Could she handle the transition from modeling to serious acting? Was she merely another blonde beauty in an endless cycle of Hollywood starlets? These doubts, amplified by gossip and the scrutiny of the press, added another layer of strain to her young life. Dorothy Stratten's public image was one of effortless grace, but in reality, she was a young woman caught between two worlds: the innocence of where she had come from and the dangerous intensity of the world she now inhabited. It was a delicate balance, and one that would soon collapse in the most tragic way imaginable. The summer of 1980 should have marked Dorothy Stratten's brightest season. She had just been crowned Playmate of the Year, secured acting roles, and was in discussions about future projects that might finally cement her place in Hollywood. But behind the celebration, her marriage to Paul Snider was unraveling at a dangerous pace. Dorothy had grown close to Peter Bogdanovich, not only professionally but also romantically, and she was preparing to formally separate from Snider. For a man who had built his identity around discovering her, the thought of losing her entirely drove him into a spiral of rage and despair. On August 14, 1980, Dorothy agreed to meet Snider at the home they had once shared in Los Angeles. Friends would later recall that she had dreaded this meeting, but her kind nature made her reluctant to sever ties without at least one final conversation. What happened next has been reconstructed from police reports and speculation, but the truth remains chilling. Dorothy never left that house alive. Snider ended her life in an act that stunned even seasoned investigators before taking his own. Dorothy was just 20 years old. When news of her passing broke, it sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. Hugh Hefner called it one of the darkest moments in Playboy history. For Peter Bogdanovich, it was a personal devastation that would alter the course of his career and his life forever. The press swarmed the tragedy, turning every detail of Dorothy's short life into headline fodder. Tabloids painted lurid stories of jealousy, betrayal, and obsession. To the public, Dorothy became not just a model or actress, but a symbol of Hollywood's darkest undercurrents. An innocent beauty destroyed by the very forces that had propelled her toward stardom. Over time, her story was retold again and again, often blurring the line between fact and myth. The 1983 film Star 80, directed by Bob Fosse, attempted to capture her final years, portraying her as a fragile dreamer swallowed by a predatory world. Yet even in these retellings, one truth remained unshakable. Dorothy Stratten's death was a tragedy that came too soon, a haunting reminder of how fame, love, and control can collide with catastrophic consequences. Her life had lasted just 2 decades, but the circumstances of her death etched her name permanently into Hollywood's collective memory. She became a ghostly figure, a symbol of the fragile line between beauty and danger in the entertainment world. In the wake of Dorothy Stratten's death, Hollywood paused in disbelief. It was not just the loss of a promising young actress. It was the sudden extinguishing of a dream that seemed destined for greatness. For many, Dorothy became a tragic symbol of innocence colliding with obsession, of stardom intertwined with danger. Hugh Hefner, who had championed her rise, called her story one of the most heartbreaking in Playboy's history. To him, Dorothy represented the ultimate tragedy of beauty exploited and destroyed. The Playboy Mansion, usually a place of endless parties and allure, fell into a somber silence as her fellow playmates and friends grappled with the shocking news. Peter Bogdanovich, the acclaimed director who had seen in Dorothy a star waiting to be born, was shattered. He poured his grief into the book The Killing of the Unicorn, a deeply personal reflection not only on Dorothy's life, but also on the culture he believed had contributed to her downfall. His career never fully recovered, shadowed by the sorrow of her loss. He would later even marry Dorothy's younger sister, Louise, a decision that raised eyebrows but, according to him, was rooted in shared grief and a desperate attempt to preserve Dorothy's memory. In popular culture, Dorothy's story became a cautionary tale. The film star 1983, though controversial, etched her story into cinematic history. Actress Mariel Hemingway portrayed Dorothy, while Eric Roberts played Paul Snider in a chilling performance that earned critical acclaim. For audiences, the film was both unsettling and heartbreaking, a reminder that behind the glossy pages of magazines and the shimmer of Hollywood lights lay darker truths. Yet Dorothy's legacy is not defined only by tragedy. For those who knew her, she remains remembered as a kind, gentle soul with an almost old-fashioned grace. Friends and colleagues often spoke of her humility, her generosity, and the way she treated everyone, from photographers to fellow actresses, with warmth and sincerity. Even in the brief span of her career, she left behind a portfolio of work that showed glimmers of a bright acting future. Today, Dorothy Stratten endures as a haunting figure in Hollywood lore. Her photographs still captivate. Her story still inspires documentaries, books, and retrospectives. She is remembered as a young woman who embodied both the dream and the danger of fame, a reminder of how fragile beauty and success can be when placed in the wrong hands. Her legacy lingers, not only in the tragedies retold but in the bittersweet question she left behind. What might have been? Dorothy Stratten's story is not simply that of a model-turned-actress. It is a haunting parable of beauty, ambition, and vulnerability, of how swiftly dreams can be reshaped into tragedy when innocence meets obsession. She began life as a quiet, gentle girl from Vancouver, working at a Dairy Queen, never imagining that her face would one day be compared to Marilyn Monroe. For a fleeting moment, Dorothy seemed poised to define a new era of Hollywood glamour. And yet, within that same moment, the shadows that had gathered around her consumed everything. Her tale reminds us that fame, for all its shimmer, is rarely without a darker cost. Dorothy's kindness, her reluctance to hurt others, and her inability to sever toxic ties became the very threads that unraveled her future. She was admired, adored, and in many ways protected by Hollywood, but she was also trapped in a web of jealousy and control that no one, perhaps not even she herself, fully recognized until it was too late. More than 40 years after her passing, Dorothy's name still resonates because her story carries universal echoes. The fragility of youth, the intoxication of beauty, and the dangers of power in the wrong hands. She was not merely a victim, nor simply a starlet lost too soon. She was a young woman with genuine talent and an aura that still speaks through photographs and film reels. To remember Dorothy is to remember the fleeting nature of life's most dazzling promises. Her legacy, though born of tragedy, continues to inspire reflection. She is a reminder that even the brightest lights can be extinguished too soon, and that behind every glamorous smile may lie struggles unseen. Perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: had Dorothy Stratten lived, would she have become the next great Hollywood legend? Or was she always destined to be remembered as the shimmering promise that fate stole before it could bloom? The truth remains forever out of reach. If you found her story moving, consider subscribing for more untold legacies, because behind every icon, there is always a shadow waiting to be revealed.